Welcome back to Star Narratives, the podcast. This is accessible and relatable astrology that teaches you how to support your emotional health using the wisdom of the zodiac. I'm your host, Natha Campanella. It's another solo cast with me, Natha Campanella. Before we get started on the sign of Gemini, I want to tell you about something that's happening right now, and that is called eclipse season. The eclipses are coming. We have our first in a series of 3 on June 5th, but we are in the shadow of the eclipse. And eclipses are exciting, they are transformational, and sometimes they really, really change our world. And I've put together a really cool course on eclipses. And if you want to check it out, you will learn so much about new moons and full moons and eclipses, and the kinds of transformation that you can expect to see in your own life. And we get really specific in this course. So you will leave with really solid information about what to expect, what it's going to feel like, and ideas for what you want to create in your life moving forward. It is a powerful time to consciously create. And I invite you to take this course with me and learn how to do that. You can check it out and get registered on my website, nathacampanella.com. Hello, welcome. It is Gemini season. Gemini is a mutable air sign. So remember that the mutable signs, which are Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, and Pisces, are the signs that need flexibility. They can be somewhat non-committal, and that's because they have the gift of waiting to see if something different or something better comes along. The mutable signs are all in times of transition. So right now in the Northern Hemisphere, we are moving out of spring and into summer. And while the sun is in Gemini, we're doing that transition. And that is true for all of the mutable signs. The sun is in those signs when there is a transition. And so you can think of mutable signs as transitional signs. So air is mental activity. It's about thoughts, it's about concepts and ideas. And if you have a lot of air in your chart, you are probably up in your head a lot, using your mind and your brain to process things, as opposed to somebody who has a lot of water in their chart, and they would be processing the world through their emotions. Now, you may have a lot of water and a lot of air, or a lot of fire, and fire people process through energy and action, and earth people process through logic and really taking time to make decisions, looking at all of the variables. And how that differs with the air signs is that air signs aren't the most thorough necessarily, because there's so much information coming in and being processed that there can be missed steps, there can be missed details, because it's fast moving. And Gemini as a sign is particularly fast moving. It is ruled by the planet Mercury. Mercury also rules Virgo, which is an earth sign. Mercury is a planet that is really the fastest moving planet. It zips around the zodiac quite quickly. And when you think about the ways that a lot of people communicate, they talk quickly. And that is very Mercury and Gemini in nature. Mercury is about communication. And so Mercury in Gemini is particularly communicative. Mercury is also about the things that we use to fill our time. And we see that show up a little bit more in the Virgo archetype, which I will be talking about in a few months once we are in Virgo season. But Gemini Mercury is very fast moving, and there's also a time component. So I'm going to talk about that. Gemini, though, is about connecting with people through words, using our language, using our eloquence, and getting what we need through conversation. So you might know and love some Gemini people, and they might have a reputation of being a little bit flaky or a little bit high strung or even undependable. And those are all valid, not to offend any Gemini people out there. I have a lot of Gemini in my chart. Not to offend you, but the thing that happens with Gemini is that the activity, the mental activity gets moving so quickly that sometimes it's hard to stop and it's hard to slow down and focus. And that is one of the things that Gemini people are trying to learn in this lifetime. How can I slow my mind down enough to really look at the details of what is happening? Because Mercury in Gemini is about details, is about getting very, very pointed and looking to see what is really here. Now, if you have an idea about Gemini people in your mind, about them being somewhat duplicitous, that is also an accurate description. And as you know, if you've listened to me before, I don't ever look at archetypes as they are good or bad. It's just what is here. And like in everything in life, there are high sides and there are low sides. And the low side, one of the low sides of Gemini, is that there is some duplicity that happens. Gemini is represented by the twins. And Gemini is a sign that doesn't really like to go very deep. It likes to rest on the surface and taste a little bit of everything, try a little bit of everything. And in that lack of desire to go deep also comes a quality of not wanting to get into really deep conversations that are heavy or that don't feel good or that have elements of like, oh God, this is so uncomfortable. I really don't want to have this conversation. And Gemini will avoid that. And so one of the things that Gemini people learn to do very early is that they learn how to kind of cage the truth. They learn how to connect in with somebody and really get a sense of what this person wants to hear. And then Gemini will give it to them. And so, you know, if you are on the receiving end of that and you feel as if somebody with a lot of Gemini in their chart has been dishonest, that might leave a bad taste in your mouth. But I will defend this Gemini archetype and say that many times it's just a simple avoidance of wanting to avoid drama, wanting to avoid discomfort, and wanting to keep things light and moving, right? Unlike with Scorpio, for example, Scorpio loves deep, heavy conversations. And, you know, you can get sort of mired in a one conversation where you're just going over this thing. And Gemini doesn't like that. Gemini also gets bored very quickly. And so that, I think, can be a frustration, especially for people that are in relationship with people that have some Gemini placements, is that Gemini placements need mental stimulation. And when boredom sets in, Gemini will detach up and out. And so know that if you are feeling like your Gemini person isn't giving you the attention that you think you deserve, that you might want to try to stimulate them somehow by either planning a really fun and interesting activity or, you know, seducing them through the mind. That's what I always say with Gemini is Gemini wants to be seduced through the mind with ideas and concepts and interesting things to think about and talk about. And by the way, when I say somebody that has a lot of Gemini in their chart, here's what I mean. We all have a sun sign, and most of us know our sun signs. When we're reading horoscopes, that's what we're looking at. Or when somebody says, what's your sign? They're talking about the sun sign. Or when somebody says a star sign, they're talking about a sun sign. And that's fine. Our sun is a very personal planet. Well, it's a star. But it's a very small part of the picture. And if you were to look at your natal chart, which is just a map of where the planets were in the sky, you might find that you have several planets in a sign. And so if you look at your chart, and by the way, you can get a free natal chart on astro.com or on just astrology.com. There are plenty of places to get free natal charts if you want one. You can look and you can see. And if you find that you have several planets in a sign, well, then you know you can be considered a very fill-in-the-blank kind of person. So when I say I have a lot of Gemini in my chart, what that means is I have several placements, and therefore I am very Gemini in nature. Now, I am also very other things in nature, and you will find that will be true for you as well. And that's one of the things that I love about astrology and that I kind of don't like about horoscopes is that we are so rounded and we have so much depth and so many layers to our astrology that to just say, oh, I have a Gemini sun, and therefore that means that I am chatty and mental and quick moving. That might be true every once in a while, but it might not tell the whole picture. Or, it might. And so we just wouldn't know unless we went into your natal chart and had a look. And if you are interested in getting a full astrology reading with a professional astrologer or with me, I would highly recommend it because it is one of the most informative ways that you can see yourself clearly from a different perspective than you usually do. Now, here's something when we're talking about losing the interest of a Gemini. Here's what happens. People that have a lot of air in their chart, whether that be Aquarius, Libra, or Gemini, but particularly Libra, have a lot of skills in the mental department. These are people that are typically highly intelligent and process information quickly. Now, highly intelligent is subjective. Some of these air people love school. Maybe they're scientific. But some of these air people are just really socially intelligent and really know how to work a crowd. So know that, air and intelligence go hand in hand, but it's very different versions of intelligence. But what happens with Gemini is that because Gemini can process information so quickly, if the information that is coming at them is slow, Gemini has to fill up that space somehow. So I'll use a personal example. When I was in elementary school, the teachers liked to have all of the students open up to a page in the textbook. And then the teachers would ask every student to read out loud. And I would get incredibly frustrated when she would choose a slow reader because I found it hard to concentrate. My brain was moving too quickly. By the time that they had read a sentence, I had already finished the entire piece that they were supposed to read. And so then my mind would go elsewhere. I would be thinking about things, I would be fantasizing, I would be quote unquote spaced out. And in fact, I remember my parents oftentimes getting on my case for being spaced out. And now that I understand as an adult what was really happening was that I was processing the information coming in too quickly. And then I had all of this extra time to do something with. And that was a frustration with school in general. So if you can relate to this, know that same thing might be happening to you. And then you end up looking to people like you're flaky, or like you're not paying attention, or you're disinterested. When really it's just that you're trying to fill up the space with other things that are interesting, because Gemini really hates to be bored. Boredom is one of the things that is quite painful for Gemini. And as I said earlier, Gemini is about how we fill our time. And so when we talk about this idea of being busy, Geminis are often really busy, as are Virgos. What you want to do is you want to really analyze, though, what you're filling your time with. Like, what does your busyness do for you? Is it just like a distraction for feeling things? Because Gemini doesn't like to feel things. It's not emotional. Is it just that you get moving so quickly, there's a sense of inertia, you can't stop? Is the busyness really serving you? Is it just being a distraction? Because with Gemini not wanting to go deep, there's this sense of being very superficial, keeping everything on the surface. But too many things on the surface just gets overwhelming. And then your nervous system gets really activated and kind of jacked up. And so you'll find that Gemini people in general can be nervous. They can be, really kind of anxious because they have so much going on. It's like they have so many balls in the air that they can't ever really focus in on any one thing. And that can be hard. So if you're relating to this, really give some thought to what you're filling your time up with and what is motivating that. Are you just using busyness to distract? Because Gemini is a distractor. It is distracting. So, like I said, one of the goals of Gemini is the ability to pivot. Gemini is across the zodiac from Sagittarius. Gemini lives in the third house, and Sagittarius lives in the ninth house. And the third and ninth house axis is about truth, exploring the truth, truth in words, personal truth, political truth, objective truth. And where Sagittarius finds it very hard to zoom in and really look at the details of what's happening, that is one of the gifts of Gemini. And so when I say the ability to pivot, there's this sense that if you have Gemini, or even if you're just using the energy of Gemini, we all have Gemini in our chart somewhere, to really look at the details, give some of that high processing skill that you have to sift through what's really happening. Try to perceive what you see and what you hear without judgment. Sagittarius across the zodiac perceives with judgment oftentimes. But the goal of Gemini is to try to perceive without judging, try to connect with people. And if possible, pivot, change your mind if you need to. And Gemini is very good at that. Now, being in the third house is an area of life, the area of communication. It's also related to short trips, like trips to the store, trips around town. It's also related to our siblings. But there's a big influence around communication, how we speak, how we communicate, how adept we are at those things. And let me tell you, we are a culture of people that is not very good at communicating. I see yelling. I see people trying to assert their opinion and get people to agree with them. Or I see people brushing things under the rug, not even starting a conversation that needs to be had. I see gossip. I see triangulation, where we go to a third person to complain about the other person, right? Instead of just going to the other person and saying, hey, I have a problem, or hey, you really hurt my feelings. You go to a third person and you say, well, you'll never guess what I have to talk about. And gossip is very Gemini in nature, by the way. But if you are doing interpersonal work, and I assume you are if you're listening to this podcast, I encourage you, especially while the sun is in Gemini, to really give some thought to conversation. Are you good at communicating? Do you say what you feel? Do you say yes when you mean yes and no when you mean no? Do you look people in the eyes when you speak with them? Do you listen? There's a great question I love to ask people, ask clients sometimes, which is, when somebody else is talking, are you listening or are you waiting to talk? And so that's a good Gemini question. And there are all of these weird communication things that we do, right, that really get in the way of clean and clear communication. There's the triangulation that I just mentioned. There's this idea that you throw so many words and concepts into a single conversation with somebody that they get really confused and they kind of lose the plot. There's stonewalling, where you just refuse to have a conversation with somebody. You just say, nope, I'm not going to do it. There's so many dysfunctional ways that we communicate. And if you're curious about your own dysfunction, look back to your parents. Because we learn a lot about how to communicate through our parents. And hopefully, as we get older, we release some of that baggage and we begin to communicate in much healthier ways. But if there was a culture in your household of not talking about things and brushing them under the rug, there's a good chance you do that. If there's a culture in your household of people screaming at each other and arguing to get their points across, well, you might do that. Poor boundaries? Yeah, you probably do that. So anyway, it's interesting just to give that some thought, because with Gemini, we want to really use our ability to be witty and intelligent and curious and articulate to communicate. We want to be clever. We want to continue to work on the skill of speaking, of writing, of conversing with people. And especially when the sun is in Gemini, that is a good time to do that. And the sun slips into Gemini around May 21st. And then it will leave Gemini for the sign of Cancer around June 21st. And those dates aren't totally accurate. I'm pulling them off the top of my head, but you get the idea. One more aspect of Gemini is around social etiquette. Now, this is one of the reasons why Gemini people are this idea of speaking out of both sides of their mouth, or shape-shifting, or caging the truth, is that when it comes to social graces, Gemini people are very aware of what is required in order to be accepted into a group. And that doesn't always mean that you have to just play along, that you always have to say the right thing, or that you always have to please. And Gemini can lose sight of that. Gemini is not a natural pleaser necessarily, like Libra is. But like I said, Gemini just wants to avoid the drama. And Gemini says what needs to be said, what Gemini thinks needs to be said. So one of the big lessons with Gemini is that we're really playing with communication that is effective, that there's an exchange of information that is understood by both parties. And sometimes that will look like repeating back. This is always a good exercise for Gemini people, is repeat back what you think you've heard to somebody, to make sure you got it right. Make sure that you really heard what you thought you heard, and that it's not just your story of what you thought you heard. So that is a good lesson, a good exercise when we're looking at Gemini things. How can I communicate as effectively as possible? How can I make sure that I am heard and that they are heard and that we're actually having the same conversation? How often do you have a conversation with somebody and afterwards you look back and you think, were we even having the same conversation? And, now that we are communicating so often via text, where we don't have tone of voice and we don't have body language or inflection, it can be even harder to really communicate, especially if we're just tapping off text, just rapid fire, right? A lot of stuff gets said that maybe is misperceived. So these are just questions, some things for you to think about as we're in Gemini season, or as you're really looking at the Gemini elements in your life. And I hope that you enjoyed this. Have a good one. I will talk to you again in Cancer season. Season of the crab. Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to work with me privately or read more about all of the numerous ways to work with me, visit my website, nathacampanella.com. I really appreciate any time that you take to leave a review of this podcast on any of the platforms that you listen on. It helps other people to find it. And of course, if you enjoy this podcast, share it widely and freely with those that you know and love. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.